A mother's instinct is to protect her child. But what happens when the person paid to ensure her safety becomes the source of her distress? On a packed flight from Atlanta to London, one black mother and her crying baby were denied basic human decency by a flight attendant with a hidden agenda. She thought her uniform gave her power, but she underestimated the woman in seat 23B. Buckle up, Dark Stories viewers, because this tale of subtle racism and shocking karma will leave you speechless. This isn't just a story about bad customer service. It's about subtle racism, a desperate phone call to the top, and the devastating, life-altering karma that followed. You won't believe what happened next on Dark Stories. The rumble of the Boeing 787 Dreamliner was a familiar lullaby to Dr. Ammani Williams, a pediatric cardiologist who had flown this transatlantic route more times than she could count. But tonight, the familiar drone was a jagged noise against the symphony of her own anxieties. Nestled in her arms was the source of both her greatest joy and her current escalating stress, 6-month-old Leo, a tiny human with lungs that defied his size. The flight from Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International to London Heathrow was a necessary evil. Ammani was presenting her groundbreaking research on neonatal heart murmurs at a major European conference, a culmination of 3 years of relentless work, a career-defining opportunity. Leaving Leo behind wasn't an option. Her husband, Michael, was on a military deployment in Japan, and the thought of being separated from her baby for a week was more terrifying than any turbulence. So, here they were in the cramped confines of economy class, seat 23B. Leo, who had been a perfect angel during the chaotic boarding process, decided the moment of ascent was his cue to protest. His cries started as a whimper, a tiny balloon of sound, before inflating into a full-blown, piercing wail that seemed to vibrate through the very fuselage of the aircraft. Ammani went through her mental checklist with the calm precision of a surgeon. Diaper? Changed. Hunger? Fed, burped twice. She rocked him, her body swaying in a rhythm honed over countless sleepless nights. She hummed his favorite lullaby, a soft, low tune that usually worked like a charm. Tonight, it was useless. The cries continued, sharp and relentless, each one a fresh stab of panic in Ammani's chest. She could feel the stares of her fellow passengers, a mixture of sympathy, irritation, and outright hostility. The air, already thin at 30,000 feet, grew thick with judgment. That's when she first saw her, the flight attendant. She was a woman in her late 40s with a severe blonde bob that looked lacquered into place and a slash of crimson lipstick that seemed to be her only feature. Her name tag read Karen. It was almost too perfect. Karen was moving down the aisle with a forced, brittle smile plastered on her face, her movements sharp and efficient. As she passed Ammani's row, her eyes flickered towards the crying infant, and the smile tightened into a barely concealed sneer. It was a micro-expression, a fleeting tightening of the muscles around her mouth. But to Ammani, it was as loud as a klaxon. An hour into the flight, Leo's cries had not subsided. Ammani was drenched in a cold sweat, her arms aching, her own tears threatening to spill over. She needed to warm his bottle again, a small comfort that just might grant them a few moments of peace. She saw the call button, a tiny beacon of hope above her head. She pressed it. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Flight attendants moved past, their faces a mask of professional indifference, but Karen seemed to be pointedly ignoring her row. Ammani could see her up ahead, laughing with a passenger in business class, her voice a bright, tinkling sound that grated on Ammani's raw nerves. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, Karen sauntered back down the aisle, her hips swaying with a practiced nonchalance. She stopped at row 23 but addressed the man in the aisle seat, a burly businessman who had his headphones on and was pointedly ignoring the drama. "Everything all right here, sir?" she asked, her voice dripping with saccharine sweetness. "I'm fine," he grunted, not even bothering to look up. Karen then turned her gaze to Ammani, her blue eyes as cold and hard as chips of ice. The smile was gone. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her tone flat, accusatory. Ammani, exhausted and desperate, tried to keep her voice steady. "Yes, please. Could you possibly warm this bottle for me, just for a minute or two? He's having a really hard time, and this usually helps him settle." She held up the small plastic bottle, a peace offering. Karen stared at the bottle as if it were a biohazard. She didn't move to take it. Instead, she crossed her arms, a gesture of defiance that was both petty and profound. "Ma'am, we are in the middle of service. I can't be running back and forth to the galley for individual requests. You should have prepared for this before you boarded." The accusation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. You should have prepared, as if Ammani hadn't packed and repacked Leo's diaper bag a dozen times. As if she hadn't spent weeks planning every detail of this trip to minimize disruption. As if she wasn't a capable, loving mother who was simply at the end of her rope. "I did prepare," Ammani said, her voice trembling slightly. "But babies can be unpredictable. It would only take a moment. Please." Karen's eyes narrowed. "The galley is for official crew use only during service. It's a safety protocol." She delivered the line with a smug finality, as if she had just quoted federal aviation law. She then turned her attention to the passenger on the other side of Ammani, a young woman with pink hair who was watching the exchange with wide, sympathetic eyes. "Can I get you anything, miss? A drink? A snack?" The blatant, targeted dismissal was a slap in the face. Ammani felt a hot flush of anger rise up her neck, a fierce, protective rage that momentarily eclipsed her exhaustion. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was a mother being deliberately obstructed from caring for her child. She took a deep breath, trying to rein in her emotions. There had to be another way. "Is there anyone else who could help me? Another flight attendant?" Karen let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound like breaking glass. "We're all quite busy, as you can imagine. Perhaps you should try to control your child. Other passengers are trying to sleep." Control your child. The words were laced with a venom that went beyond simple irritation. It was a coded message, one Ammani had heard in different forms her entire life. It was the language of prejudice, the subtle insinuation that she, a black woman, was somehow less capable, less disciplined, less deserving of consideration. The businessman in the aisle seat, who had finally removed his headphones, chimed in. "For God's sake, can't you just help her? The kid's been screaming for an hour. Maybe a warm bottle is all he needs." Karen shot him a look of pure fury. "Sir, I am following airline policy. I will not have my authority questioned." She then turned on her heel and marched back towards the front of the plane, her back ramrod straight. Ammani was left in the wake of her departure, stunned and shaking. Leo's cries seemed to mock her, a soundtrack to her humiliation. She looked down at his tear-streaked face, his tiny body racked with sobs, and her heart broke. She had never felt so alone, so utterly powerless. But as the initial shock wore off, something else began to bubble up from the depths of her despair. It was a cold, hard resolve. Karen had made a critical mistake. She had mistaken Ammani's exhaustion for weakness. She had mistaken her plea for help as a sign of incompetence, and she had no idea who she was dealing with. Ammani reached into her diaper bag, her fingers bypassing the spare pacifiers and teething rings. They closed around the cool, smooth surface of her cell phone. She knew the Wi-Fi on these flights was notoriously spotty, a gamble at best, but she had to try. Her fingers flew across the screen, her thumbs typing out a familiar name in her contacts list, a name that hadn't been in the news for a while but still carried immense weight in the aviation industry. She pressed the call button, not the one above her head, but the one on her phone screen. It was a long shot, a desperate Hail Mary from 30,000 feet. But as the phone began to ring, a strange sense of calm washed over her. The storm inside her was beginning to subside, replaced by an icy certainty. The turbulence in the cabin was nothing compared to the storm that was about to break over Karen's head. Hold on tight, Dark Stories fans, because this call is about to change everything. The Wi-Fi calling icon flickered, a fragile green light in the dim cabin. One ring, two. Ammani held her breath, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Leo's cries had momentarily softened into hiccuping sobs, as if he sensed the shift in his mother's energy from desperation to determination. On the third ring, a voice answered, gravelly with sleep but instantly recognizable. "This had better be a mid-air emergency, Ammani." A small, wry smile touched Ammani's lips. "You could say that, Richard. How's retirement?" There was a rustle on the other end of the line, the sound of a man sitting up in bed. Richard Fairchild, the semi-retired, legendary former CEO of Aerovista Airlines, the very airline she was flying, was now wide awake. Retirement is boring, and you know it. What's wrong? You sound stressed. Is it Leo? Leo is the catalyst, not the cause, Ammani said, her voice low and steady. She quickly recounted the incident with Karen, her words precise and clinical, devoid of the raw emotion that was churning inside her. She detailed the dismissive tone, the refusal to help, the thinly veiled insinuation that she was an incompetent mother. She was a cardiologist reporting symptoms, building a case. Richard listened without interruption, the silence on his end more damning than any outburst. And her name is Karen, he finally asked, his voice now laced with a cold fury that mirrored her own. Flight 88 from Atlanta to London. That's the one, Ammani confirmed. Stay on the line, Richard said, his tone shifting into the commanding presence that had once dominated boardrooms. Ammani heard the clicking of a keyboard in the background, the soft, deadly sound of power being wielded. Meanwhile, in the galley, Karen was complaining to her colleague, a younger flight attendant named Chloe. I swear, some people think a plane ticket entitles them to a personal butler, Karen scoffed, pouring herself a cup of coffee. She can't even handle her own kid. It's disruptive. It's unprofessional. Chloe, who had witnessed the exchange, shifted uncomfortably. She just asked for some hot water, Karen. It would have taken 30 seconds. It's the principle of the thing, Karen snapped. You give them an inch, and they take a mile. You have to establish boundaries, especially with that kind of passenger. Chloe frowned. What kind of passenger? Karen just smirked, a knowing, ugly look that made Chloe's stomach turn. She didn't need to say the words. The implication was clear. Their conversation was interrupted by the sharp, insistent beep of the cabin intercom. The captain's voice, usually a calm, reassuring baritone, was tight and strained. Karen, please report to the flight deck immediately. Karen's eyebrows shot up in surprise. It was highly unusual for a flight attendant to be summoned to the cockpit mid-flight unless there was a serious security or medical emergency. A flicker of unease went through her. She smoothed down her already immaculate uniform, took a deep breath, and walked the length of the plane, her heels clicking with an authority she no longer felt. As she passed row 23, she shot a triumphant, icy glare at Ammani, who was still on her phone, her face calm and unreadable. Karen interpreted the look as a sign of her own victory. See, her eyes seemed to say, I'm in charge here. The flight deck door clicked shut behind her, sealing her off from the rest of the cabin. The cockpit was bathed in the soft glow of instrument panels. The captain, a seasoned pilot named Captain Miller, and his first officer turned to look at her. Neither of them was smiling. Karen, Captain Miller began, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. I just received a satellite call from Richard Fairchild. Karen's blood ran cold. Richard Fairchild, the former CEO. The man was a legend, a phantom who had retired years ago but whose influence still permeated every corner of Aerovista. Sir, was all she could manage. He was displeased, Captain Miller said, an understatement of epic proportions. He informed me of an incident regarding a passenger in seat 23B, a doctor, Ammani Williams, and her infant son. Karen's mind raced. How could Fairchild possibly know? It must have been the businessman in the aisle seat. He must have had some connection, some way of getting a message out. The thought that a passenger had gone over her head straight to the top was infuriating. Sir, with all due respect, the passenger was being disruptive, Karen began, launching into her carefully constructed narrative. Her baby was crying uncontrollably, and she was demanding special treatment during a critical phase of our service. I was simply enforcing airline policy. Captain Miller held up a hand, cutting her off. Were you aware, Karen, that Dr. Williams is not just any passenger, that she is one of the world's leading pediatric cardiologists, that she is flying to London to represent this airline in this country at a major medical conference? Karen's mouth went dry. No, sir, I was not. And were you aware, the captain continued, his voice dropping to a dangerously low level, that 6 years ago, Richard Fairchild's newborn granddaughter had a rare, life-threatening heart condition, that she needed a complex, experimental surgery, and that the only surgeon in the world willing and able to perform it, the surgeon who saved her life, was Dr. Ammani Williams? The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The low hum of the engines faded into a dull roar in Karen's ears. C-23B. Dr. Williams. The crying baby. It all coalesced into a single, horrifying image of her own professional demise. The woman she had dismissed, belittled, and deliberately antagonized was not just a passenger. She was a hero in the eyes of the one man who still held the power to end her career with a single word. "Sir, I had no idea," she stammered, her voice a pathetic whisper. "That's just it, Karen," Captain Miller said, his eyes filled with a weary disappointment. "You didn't need to know. Your job is to provide safe, courteous, and compassionate service to every single passenger who steps on this aircraft, regardless of who they are or who they know. You failed spectacularly." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Richard has made his wishes clear. As of this moment, you are relieved of your duties. You will remain on the flight deck for the remainder of the journey. Upon landing at Heathrow, you will be escorted from the aircraft by security. Your employment with Aerovista Airlines is terminated, effective immediately." The finality of his words was like a physical blow. Terminated. Fired in midair. The humiliation was absolute, the fall from grace swift and brutal. The crimson slash of her lipstick suddenly seemed like a gaping wound, the perfectly coiffed hair a ridiculous, pathetic helmet. Her mind flashed back to her smug, triumphant glare at Ammani just moments before. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. She had thought she was putting a difficult passenger in her place. She had thought she was asserting her authority. But all she had done was write the final, damning chapter of her own career. As the reality of her situation began to dawn, a single, terrifying thought cut through the fog of her shock and disbelief. Her husband, Mark, had just been laid off from his job at a major tech firm. Her salary was all they had. They were already struggling to keep up with the mortgage on their suburban home. This wasn't just the loss of a job. It was the beginning of a free fall. The storm she had so casually inflicted upon Ammani had turned back on her, magnified 1,000 times over. And as the coast of Ireland appeared on the navigation screen, a tiny sliver of green in a vast blue ocean, Karen knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that she was about to crash. Back in seat 23B, a strange peace had descended. Chloe, the younger flight attendant, had appeared moments after Karen was summoned to the cockpit. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. "Dr. Williams," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, "I am so sorry. Please, let me get that for you." She took the bottle from Ammani's hand with a reverence usually reserved for a holy relic and scurried away to the galley. She returned moments later with the perfectly warmed bottle and a glass of cool water for Ammani. "Is there anything else I can get you? A pillow, a blanket, a glass of champagne?" Ammani, who was gently feeding a now calm Leo, managed a weak smile. "The water is perfect. Thank you, Chloe. You've been very kind." The simple words of gratitude seemed to steady the young flight attendant. She nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "We're not all like her," she said, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engines. It was a quiet apology, a small act of solidarity that meant the world to Ammani. The rest of the flight passed in a blur of surreal tranquility. The businessman in the aisle seat, whose name Ammani learned was Tom, offered to hold Leo while she used the restroom, his earlier gruffness replaced by a gentle, grandfatherly concern. The young woman with pink hair, a graphic design student named Maya, showed Ammani pictures of her own baby niece, creating a small, temporary bubble of warmth and understanding in the cold, impersonal cabin. As the plane began its descent into London, the fastened seatbelt sign pinging on, a sense of dread began to creep back into Ammani's heart. She had done what she had to do. She had protected her child. But she was not a vindictive person. The thought of a woman losing her livelihood, her entire world upended because of a single, terrible lapse in judgment, did not bring her any joy. It was a heavy, unavoidable consequence, a life altered by a chain of events she had been forced to set in motion. Upon landing, as the plane taxied towards the gate, Captain Miller's voice came over the intercom once more. His tone was different now, infused with a warmth and sincerity that had been absent before. "Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Aerovista Airlines, I want to apologize for any lapse in service you may have experienced on this flight. We pride ourselves on our commitment to our passengers, and tonight we fell short of that standard. We will be reviewing our customer service protocols to ensure that this does not happen again." He paused, then added, "Furthermore, I would like to personally thank Dr. Ammani Williams for her grace and professionalism under difficult circumstances. Her contributions to the medical field are an inspiration to us all, and we are honored to have her on board." A ripple of murmurs went through the cabin. Heads turned towards Ammani, no longer with looks of irritation, but with a newfound respect and curiosity. The anonymous crying baby and his frazzled mother had been transformed into a VIP, and her child a living testament to the hidden stories that every passenger carries with them. When the cabin door finally opened, two stoic, uniformed security officers were waiting on the jet bridge. They boarded the plane and walked directly to the flight deck. A moment later, Karen emerged, flanked by the two officers. She was a shadow of her former self. Her face was ashen, her crimson lipstick smeared. Her eyes were red-rimmed and vacant, staring straight ahead, refusing to meet the gazes of the passengers she had served for over 2 decades. Her movements were stiff and robotic as she was escorted down the aisle, a silent, public procession of shame. As she passed row 23, her eyes, for a fleeting second, met Ammani's. There was no anger in her gaze, no defiance, only a vast, empty expanse of despair. In that moment, Ammani saw not a villain, but a broken woman, a life unraveling in real time. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture not of forgiveness, but of acknowledgement, an acknowledgement of their shared, terrible humanity. The moment Karen was off the plane, a palpable sense of relief washed over the cabin. The tension that had simmered for hours finally dissipated, replaced by a buzz of excited chatter. As Ammani gathered her belongings, her diaper bag, her carry-on, her precious sleeping son Tom, the businessman, leaned over. "You know," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial, "I've flown this route 100 times. That was, without a doubt, the most satisfying in-flight entertainment I have ever witnessed." He winked, a mischievous glint in his eye. "You're a class act, Dr. Williams. A real class act." Ammani smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile this time. "Thank you, Tom, for your help." "Anytime," he said, his voice softening. "My own daughter has a little one about his age. I know how tough it can be." As she deplaned, stepping out into the bright, sterile terminal of Heathrow, Ammani felt a profound sense of exhaustion, a bone-deep weariness that went beyond jet lag. The ordeal was over. She had survived, but the victory felt hollow. The price of peace, devastatingly high. She found a quiet corner near the baggage claim, sinking into a hard plastic chair, Leo still sleeping soundly on her chest. She pulled out her phone and saw a text message from Richard. "Heard it all went down as planned. The board is meeting tomorrow. We're overhauling the entire in-flight training program. This won't happen again. You have my word. Now go get some rest. You've earned it." Ammani closed her eyes, leaning her head back against the cool wall. She had been a catalyst for change, a reluctant warrior in a battle she never wanted to fight. But as she listened to the soft, rhythmic breathing of her son, a tiny, perfect life that she would move heaven and earth to protect, she knew without a shadow of a doubt that she would do it all again. Little did she know, the story was far from over. The karma that had hit Karen with the force of a Category 5 hurricane was just the beginning. The real storm was still gathering, and its fallout would be far more destructive than anyone could have imagined. Stay with us, Dark Stories viewers, because this tale is about to go viral in ways no one saw coming. The story of Flight 88 did not stay contained within the aluminum tube of the Dreamliner. In the age of social media, secrets have wings, and this one flew at the speed of light. Maya, the pink-haired graphic design student, had discreetly filmed the entire exchange between Ammani and Karen on her phone. She had captured the dismissive tone, the smug refusal, and the raw, desperate plea in Ammani's eyes. By the time Ammani had cleared customs, Maya's video, posted to TikTok with the hashtag #AeroVistaNightmare, was already beginning to go viral. She had artfully edited it, adding dramatic music and captions that highlighted the injustice of the situation. She had also included a clip of the captain's final announcement, praising Dr. Williams, which added a powerful, validating punch to the narrative. The video was a perfect storm of outrage: a struggling mother, a helpless baby, a villainous flight attendant, and a dramatic, satisfying conclusion. It was a modern-day morality play, and the internet was here for it. By morning, it had millions of views. The story was picked up by news outlets, first the online tabloids, then the more reputable broadcasters. Flight attendant fired midair after denying help to black doctor, the headline screamed. Aerovista Airlines, caught in a PR firestorm, went into damage control mode. They issued a formal public apology to Dr. Williams, reiterating their commitment to diversity and inclusion. They announced a complete overhaul of their customer service training, promising a new program focused on empathy, compassion, and cultural sensitivity. Richard Fairchild, in a rare public statement, personally condemned the flight attendants' actions, calling them a betrayal of everything Aerovista stands for. Ammani, who had checked into her hotel and was trying to decompress before her conference, was inundated with messages. Friends, colleagues, even old medical school professors she hadn't spoken to in years reached out to offer their support. She was hailed as a hero, a symbol of grace under pressure, a woman who had stood up to prejudice and won. But the title felt ill-fitting. She hadn't wanted to be a hero. She had just wanted to be a mom taking care of her baby. The viral fame was unsettling, a harsh, invasive spotlight on what had been a deeply personal and painful experience. She declined all interview requests, wanting only to focus on her work and her son. The conference was a resounding success. Ammani presented her research with a clarity and passion that captivated her audience. Her work was praised as revolutionary, a potential game-changer for neonatal care. She was no longer just Dr. Williams, the woman from the viral video. She was Dr. Williams, the brilliant cardiologist, a leader in her field. The incident on the plane, as traumatic as it had been, had not defined her. It had only revealed the strength that was already there. On her last day in London, she received an unexpected gift basket at her hotel. It was filled with gourmet cheeses, fine wines, and a collection of rare antique medical textbooks. The card was handwritten on thick, expensive cardstock. Dear Ammani, a small token of my immense gratitude. You saved my granddaughter's life, and you have reminded my company of its soul. If there is ever anything you need, do not hesitate to ask. Yours, Richard. Tucked inside the basket was a small plush airplane toy for Leo. It was a thoughtful, personal gesture that touched Ammani deeply. It was a reminder that even in the faceless corporate world, there were still good people, people who cared. The flight home was a world away from her journey to London. She was upgraded to first class, a spacious, luxurious pod with a lie-flat bed and a privacy screen. The flight attendants treated her like royalty, their service impeccable, their smiles genuine. Chloe, the young flight attendant who had helped her, was working the first-class cabin. She greeted Ammani with a warm, genuine smile. Dr. Williams, it's so good to see you again, she said. We're all so grateful for what you did. You've started a real conversation. Things are already changing. Ammani learned that the new training program, tentatively named the Williams Protocol, was being fast-tracked. It would focus on de-escalation techniques, cultural competency, and providing support for passengers with young children. Her ordeal had become a teachable moment, a catalyst for positive institutional change. As the plane soared above the clouds, Leo sleeping peacefully in the bassinet provided for him, Ammani finally allowed herself to relax. A sense of closure, of justice served, settled over her. The story, it seemed, had reached its conclusion. But across the Atlantic, in a quiet, manicured suburb of Atlanta, the ripples of Flight 88 were just beginning to be felt. And for Karen, the woman at the center of the storm, the karma was far from over. It was about to get much, much harder. Karen didn't fly home. She was put on administrative leave and booked into a sterile, anonymous hotel near Heathrow, her passport held by the company until they had completed their internal investigation, a bureaucratic formality for a verdict that had already been delivered at 30,000 feet. For 2 days, she cycled through a fugue state of disbelief, rage, and a gut-wrenching, paralyzing fear. She was a pariah, a prisoner in a beige room, the drone of planes taking off and landing a constant, mocking reminder of the life that had been snatched away from her. When she was finally allowed to fly back to Atlanta in economy, a final petty indignity, she was a ghost of her former self. The viral video had made her infamous. Her face, twisted in a sneer of contempt, was everywhere. Her name, her age, even her hometown had been doxed by online sleuths. She was no longer Karen the flight attendant. She was #plain Karen, a meme, a cautionary tale, a digital effigy for the internet to burn. She arrived home to a house that was unervingly quiet. Her husband, Mark, was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at his laptop, his face pale and drawn. He didn't look up when she came in. "Mark," she said, her voice trembling. He finally raised his head, and his eyes were filled with a cold, hollow emptiness that scared her more than any anger. "I saw the video, Karen," he said, his voice flat. "Everyone has seen the video." "It was a misunderstanding," she began, the words sounding weak and pathetic even to her own ears. "I was just trying to do my job." "Your job," he scoffed, a bitter, humorless laugh. "Your job was to help people, not to torment a mother with a sick baby. Do you have any idea what you've done?" He turned the laptop around. It was open to his LinkedIn page. His profile picture, a smiling, confident man in a crisp blue shirt, seemed to mock them both. And then she saw the messages, dozens of them, from former colleagues, from headhunters, from potential employers he had been in talks with. "Is this your wife?" one message read, with a link to the viral video. "We're going to have to rescind our offer," said another. "We can't be associated with this kind of behavior," read a third, from a consulting company he had been doing freelance work for. The tech world was small and incestuous. Mark's layoff had been part of a massive, industry-wide downsizing. He was one of thousands of qualified people scrambling for a limited number of jobs. His reputation, his professional network, was all he had. And now it was radioactive. His name, by virtue of its association with hers, was toxic. "They think I'm like you," he whispered, his voice cracking. "They think I share your ugliness." The word hung in the air between them, sharp and poisonous. Ugliness, it was a word she had never associated with herself. She had always seen herself as polished, professional, in control. But now, seeing her own sneering face reflected in the cold, unforgiving light of the internet, she saw it too, the petty cruelty, the casual bigotry, the ugly, withered thing that lived inside her. The next few weeks were a descent into a special kind of hell. The mortgage payments, already a struggle, became an impossibility. The bank sent letters, then warnings, then a foreclosure notice. The carefully curated life they had built, the 2-story house in the good school district, the late model SUV, the country club membership, began to crumble like a sandcastle against a rising tide. Their friends, the other couples from the neighborhood with whom they shared barbecues and book club meetings, fell away. Calls went unanswered. Invitations dried up. They were social lepers, their presence a toxic reminder of a scandal that everyone wanted to forget. Karen tried to find another job. She applied for positions in customer service, in hospitality, in retail. But her name was a red flag. The moment a potential employer Googled her, the conversation would turn cold. The interview would be cut short. She was unemployable, a pariah in the very industry she had dedicated her life to. The final, devastating blow came not from a stranger on the internet or a bank or a former friend, but from her own family. Her younger sister, Sarah, called her, her voice strained and distant. "Karen," she said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "Anything," Karen said, desperate for a friendly voice, a lifeline in the swirling vortex of her despair. "The adoption agency," Sarah began, her voice trembling. "They called me today. They saw the video. They're reconsidering our application." Sarah and her husband had been trying to adopt a child for years. They had been through endless rounds of interviews, home studies, and paperwork. They had finally been matched with a baby girl, a beautiful, healthy infant who was due to be placed with them in a matter of weeks. "They're worried about the family environment," Sarah said, the words catching in her throat. "They're worried about your influence. They think you're a racist, Karen. And they don't want a child being raised in a family with a racist." The phone slipped from Karen's hand, clattering to the floor. The world went silent, the only sound the frantic, ragged beat of her own heart. She had not just lost her job, her home, her reputation. She had, through her own careless cruelty, destroyed her sister's dream of becoming a mother. She had poisoned her own family, her own blood. The karma was no longer just hard. It was biblical. It was a plague, a pestilence, a fire that consumed everything it touched. And as she slid to the floor, her body racked with sobs of a grief so profound it felt like it would tear her apart, Karen finally understood the true weight of her actions. She had refused to warm a bottle for a crying baby. It was such a small thing, a momentary lapse, a petty act of spite. But it had set in motion a chain of events that had unraveled not just her own life, but the lives of everyone she loved. The storm she had unleashed had not just turned back on her. It had become a tornado, tearing through the very foundations of her world, leaving nothing but wreckage in its wake. The foreclosure notice was the final nail in the coffin. The house, once a symbol of their success, became a monument to their failure. The carefully tended garden grew wild. The for sale sign on the lawn was a beacon of their shame. They sold what they could: the furniture, the jewelry, the second car, but it was not enough. They were drowning in a sea of debt, and there was no lifeguard in sight. Mark, a man who had always been so proud, so self-reliant, retreated into a deep, silent depression. He spent his days in a darkened room, the glow of his laptop the only light. He had become a ghost in his own home, a casualty of a war he had never signed up for. Karen, stripped of everything that had once defined her, her job, her home, her social standing, was forced to confront the person she had become. The nights were the worst. In the long, lonely hours before dawn, the faces of the people she had wronged would flash before her eyes: Ammani, her face a mask of exhaustion and despair; Leo, his tiny body racked with sobs; her sister, her voice choked with the grief that Karen had caused. One rainy Tuesday, as she was packing the last of their belongings into cardboard boxes, she came across an old photo album. She opened it to a picture of herself as a young woman, fresh out of flight attendant training. She was smiling, a genuine, unforced smile, her eyes bright with hope and excitement. She had been so proud of her uniform, so eager to travel the world, to meet new people, to be a part of something bigger than herself. What had happened to that girl? When had the hope soured into cynicism? When had the excitement curdled into a weary, jaded indifference? She traced the outline of her younger self's face, a single tear rolling down her cheek and splashing onto the glossy photograph. The journey from that bright-eyed girl to the sneering woman in the viral video had been a long and subtle one, a series of small compromises, of tiny, almost imperceptible shifts in her moral compass. It was the casual complaint about a passenger with a foreign accent. It was the shared joke tinged with prejudice in the galley. It was the slow, insidious process of othering, of dividing the world into us and them. That afternoon, she did something she hadn't done in years. She went to church. She sat in the back pew, a solitary figure in the cavernous, empty space, and she prayed. It was not a prayer for forgiveness or for redemption or for a return to her old life. It was a prayer for understanding, a prayer for the strength to face the wreckage of her life and to somehow, someway, begin to clean it up. And 2 days later, she sat down at her kitchen table, the same table where Mark had shown her the devastating LinkedIn messages, and she wrote a letter. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. "Dear Dr. Williams," it began. "I'm writing to you not to ask for your forgiveness, but to offer my most profound and sincere apology. There is no excuse for my behavior on Flight 88. It was cruel, unprofessional, and inexcusable. I was a bully. I was a racist. I was a woman who had lost her way, and I took my own unhappiness out on you and your beautiful son." She wrote for hours, the words pouring out of her in a torrent of shame and regret. She told Ammani about her job, her house, her sister's adoption, not as an excuse, but as a confession, a testament to the far-reaching consequences of her actions. "I have lost everything," she wrote. And I deserve it. The karma that has come back to me is a just and righteous one. You did not ruin my life. I did. You were simply the mirror that forced me to see the ugliness that I had become. She ended the letter with a simple, heartfelt wish. I hope that you and your son are well. I hope that you continue to do your amazing, life-saving work. And I hope that one day I can become a person who is worthy of a second chance. She sent the letter not to Aero Vista or to a PR firm, but to the pediatric cardiology department of the hospital where Ammani worked. It was a shot in the dark, a message in a bottle cast out into a vast and unforgiving ocean. Weeks later, a small, unassuming envelope arrived at the cramped, run-down apartment she and Mark were now renting. There was no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a letter written on hospital letterhead. Karen, it began. I received your letter. Thank you for your honesty. I will not lie and say that your actions did not cause me great pain. They did. But I am a doctor. I believe in healing, and I believe that everyone, no matter how lost, deserves a chance to find their way back. Ammani went on to say that she had spoken to her sister-in-law, who was a social worker at an adoption agency. She had explained the situation, the full story, the remorse, the devastating consequences. It was not a guarantee, but it was a start, a small, flickering candle of hope in the overwhelming darkness. Your journey of atonement will be a long and difficult one, Ammani wrote. It will require more than just words. It will require a fundamental change in who you are. But the fact that you have started on that journey is a testament to the human capacity for change. I wish you peace, Karen, and I hope, for your sake and for the sake of your family, that you find it. Tucked inside the letter was a check for $5,000. In the memo line, Ammani had written 2 words, for Leo. It was not a handout. It was a lesson in grace, in compassion, in the kind of radical, transformative empathy that Karen had so spectacularly failed to show. The money would not solve their problems. It would not bring back their house or their friends or the life they had lost. But it was a start, a second chance, a tiny, fragile seed of hope planted in the barren soil of their despair. Karen looked at the check, at the elegant, confident signature of the woman she had wronged. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel a flicker of something other than shame. It was a feeling of gratitude, a feeling of awe, a feeling of hope. The road ahead was long, and the scars of her past would never fully fade. But as she looked out the window of her small apartment at the vast, endless expanse of the sky, she knew that the storm was finally over. And in its wake, there was the quiet, terrifying, and ultimately liberating promise of a new beginning. The months that followed were a blur of beige walls and beige emotions. The small apartment they rented on the outskirts of Atlanta was a constant, suffocating reminder of how far they had fallen. The roar of the real jets had been replaced by the roar of the highway, a ceaseless river of noise that offered no escape. Mark remained a ghost, his world shrinking to the 4 corners of his laptop screen. He had stopped looking for work, stopped talking about the future. He was a man hollowed out by her failure, and his silence was a heavier burden than any creditor's call. Karen, stripped of her identity, her pride, and her purpose, found herself adrift in an ocean of time. The days were long, empty, and punctuated by the sharp pangs of regret. The image of her sister's face, crumpled in grief, was a recurring nightmare. The weight of that particular sin, destroying Sarah's chance at motherhood, was a physical ache in her chest. One afternoon, desperate to escape the suffocating silence of the apartment, she walked. She walked for miles with no destination in mind, her feet carrying her through unfamiliar neighborhoods. She eventually found herself standing in front of a modest, slightly rundown building with a simple sign, the Open Door Community Kitchen. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the door. This was a world she had only ever flown over, a reality she had glimpsed from a comfortable distance. But the silence of her apartment was more terrifying than the unknown that lay beyond this door. She pushed it open. The air inside was thick with the smell of simmering soup and disinfectant. It was a chaotic, bustling place filled with tired-looking volunteers and the weary faces of those who had come for a hot meal. No one noticed her. Here, she was anonymous, stripped of her name and her history. She was just a pair of hands. She found the woman in charge, a stern-faced, no-nonsense woman named Maria, and asked if she could help. Maria looked her up and down, her eyes lingering for a moment on Karen's still manicured nails, a last vestige of her former life. "Can you chop vegetables and wash dishes?" Maria asked, her tone making it clear that she had no time for dilettantes. "Yes," Karen said, her voice barely a whisper. And so her new life began. It was grueling, thankless work. She spent hours on her feet, her back aching, her hands raw from hot water and cheap soap. She chopped onions until her eyes streamed with tears, scrubbed pots crusted with old food, and mopped floors sticky with spilled soup. In the beginning, she did it as a penance, a form of self-flagellation. But slowly, something began to shift. She started to see the faces of the people she was serving, the elderly man who always said, "God bless you, dear," his voice a frail whisper, the young single mother with 2 tired children, whose gratitude for a simple plate of food was a humbling thing to witness, the veteran in the wheelchair, who told her stories of his time overseas, his eyes still haunted by things she could never imagine. These were the people she had once looked down upon from 30,000 feet, the faceless masses she had served with a brittle, professional smile. Here, on the ground, they were real. Their struggles were real. And their resilience, their dignity in the face of unimaginable hardship, put her own self-pity to shame. The ugliness she had seen in herself was a poison of the soul, a sickness born of privilege and prejudice. The hardship she saw here was a condition of life, met not with sneering contempt, but with a weary, stubborn grace. Her work at the kitchen became her anchor, the one thing that gave her days a shape and a purpose. For the first time in a long time, she felt useful. She was no longer #plain Karen, the disgraced flight attendant. She was just Karen, the woman who chopped the carrots for the stew. One Saturday, a young woman with a baby carrier strapped to her chest came through the line. The baby, no older than Leo, began to cry a high, piercing wail that cut through the noise of the kitchen. The young mother looked flustered, her face flushed with a familiar mixture of exhaustion and embarrassment. Without thinking, Karen wiped her hands on her apron, came around the serving counter, and approached the woman. "It's okay," she said, her voice soft. "Let me get you a chair. I'll hold him for you while you eat." The young mother looked at her, her eyes wide with a surprise that quickly melted into relief. She handed the baby over, and Karen, with a practiced ease she hadn't realized she still possessed, rocked the crying infant, humming a soft, low lullaby. The baby's cries subsided, his tiny body relaxing against hers. It was in that moment, holding a stranger's child, that she finally understood the true depth of her failure on Flight 88. It hadn't just been a lapse in customer service. It had been a failure of basic human decency, a failure to see another mother's pain and to offer a simple, compassionate hand. That evening, she went home and found Mark sitting in his usual spot, staring at his laptop. But this time, the screen was blank. "I got a call from Sarah today," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. Karen's heart stopped. Is everything okay?" "The adoption didn't go through," he said, and Karen's world, which had just begun to regain some semblance of color, faded back to gray. But he continued, looking at her, really looking at her for the first time in months. "She asked if you were free to come over for dinner on Sunday." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a return to the way things were. But it was a beginning, an open door. The dinner was awkward, the conversation stilted, but Karen didn't try to fill the silence with excuses or apologies. She listened. She asked Sarah about her work, about her husband's new project. She played with their dog. She washed the dishes after the meal. She showed them, through her actions, that she was trying to be a different person. As they were leaving, Sarah pulled her aside. "I heard about what you're doing at the community kitchen," she said, her voice still cautious but no longer cold. That's a good thing, Karen." The small words of acknowledgement were a balm to her wounded soul. The road to reconciliation would be long, she knew, but it was no longer blocked. Inspired by Karen's quiet determination, Mark began to stir from his stupor. He started taking online courses, not in tech, but in horticulture. He had always loved gardening, the simple, honest work of coaxing life from the soil. He started a small container garden on the tiny balcony of their apartment. And as the first green shoots began to appear, so too did a flicker of his old self. A year after the flight, Karen sat down and wrote a second letter to Ammani Williams. She told her about the kitchen, about her sister, about Mark's new passion for plants. She told her that the $5,000 had not been spent on bills, but had been put into a trust fund for her sister's future adoption expenses. It was her way of trying to repair the damage she had done, to turn a gift of grace into a legacy of hope. She ended the letter not with an apology, but with a simple statement of fact: I am not the same person I was a year ago. I hope one day to be a person who is worthy of the kindness you showed me. She received no reply, and she expected none. Her life was quiet now. It was a life of small things: the satisfaction of a perfectly simmered soup, the warmth of her husband's hand in hers, the fragile, tentative laughter she now shared with her sister. It was not the life she had planned, but it was a life that was real and honest and her own. One afternoon, as she was serving meals at the kitchen, a woman she vaguely recognized approached the counter. "You're her, aren't you?" the woman asked, her voice low. The flight attendant from the video. Karen's blood ran cold. She braced herself for the inevitable confrontation, the public shaming. She took a deep breath and met the woman's gaze. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I am." The woman just nodded, a thoughtful, appraising look in her eyes. "Well," she said, taking a plate from Karen's hand, "this is a much better look on you." And as the woman walked away, Karen allowed herself a small, fragile smile. The storm had passed. The wreckage had been cleared. And in the quiet, sunlit space that remained, something new and strong and beautiful was beginning to grow. This story is a powerful reminder that our actions, no matter how small, have consequences that can ripple out in ways we can never predict. The casual cruelty of one person set off a chain reaction that ended in devastation, but also in an unexpected and hard-won redemption. It shows that while karma can be swift and unforgiving, the human capacity for grace, for forgiveness, and for change is just as powerful. What would you have done in Ammani's situation? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Dark Stories for more true stories of justice, karma, and the human spirit. Thank you for watching.